Hello and welcome to Projector at the London Film Festival, and on this episode, Martin Scorsese re-teams with Leonardo DiCaprio and Robert De Niro for the adaptation of Killers of the Flower Moon. Forced to move into a reservation in Oklahoma, the Osage Nation becomes rich when oil is discovered on their land, attracting many to their money. Ernest Burkhart, played by Leonardo DiCaprio, returns from World War I to the ranch owned by his uncle William King Hale, played by Robert De Niro, who strongly encouraged him to marry an Osage woman to obtain the head rights to the oil and maintain their wealth. Ernest romances and marries Molly Kyle, played by Lily Gladstone, and under his uncle's instruction begins a long campaign of murder and intrigue in Molly's family to obtain more head rights, eventually attracting the attention of the recently formed FBI. Killers of the Flower Moon is based on David Grant's 2017 book of the same name, and Martin Scorsese has been trying to bring it to the screen for quite a few years now, having previously bought the film rights to the book back in 2016 before it was even published. But Scorsese was struggling with finding the right viewpoint for the material, and he eventually realised during lockdown that his script was from totally the wrong perspective. The original incarnation of Killers of the Flower Moon focused specifically on the FBI, or the Bureau of Investigation as it was known in that point in time, and especially the character of Thomas Bruce White Sr., who in the film is played by Jesse Plemons, and is a much smaller part. Originally it was going to be the central protagonist, the one played by DiCaprio, but Scorsese eventually realised that what he really needed to do to tell the story right and to do it justice was actually tell it from the inside, tell it from the perspective of the people, and especially that of the Osage, and thus reworks the script completely. So the FBI are largely characters that appear in the third act of the movie, and instead it really focuses on the crimes and what happened in Osage country. However, because of this reworking, the budget massively inflated and Paramount balked at the cost of it, similar to what happened with The Irishman, where Paramount also balked, but Netflix swooped in and saved it. Enter in Apple, who eventually acquired the project and ironically ended up forming a distribution deal with Paramount to release it theatrically, because Scorsese is of course a proud advocate of the cinema experience. So Paramount is releasing it theatrically, but largely it's a window for when it's going to be released on Apple TV Plus in the future. But the question is whether or not that 3.5 hour running time is justified, and I would say yes, it very much is. And a lot has been said about the fact that Killers of the Flower Moon is a very, very long movie, but Scorsese is taking his time creating a portrait of two different cultures. On the one hand, you have the Osage, who were moved onto the reservation in Oklahoma, but then became rich when oil was discovered on their land, making them wealthy overnight. But that didn't mean that they became respected. In fact, far from it, it just became the latest chapter in America's terrible treatment of its indigenous peoples, in that they were declared legally incompetent and required guardians over the money accrued from that oil. But Scorsese depicts the Osage as being a proud people, strong in their culture and traditions, and trying to incorporate that as much as possible. A recurring element through the film is owls, who appear as spectres of death all throughout the movie, but also Scorsese uses a lot of the Osage language in the film. Characters often switch conversations between English and Osage, often interchangeably, and that just shows the mixing of the cultures that was happening in Oklahoma. Scorsese, given his own limitations of not being an indigenous person, I think he has done as much as he can possibly do in terms of representing that culture and that particular viewpoint in the story that he has created out of this material. And on the other hand, you got the white Americans that came to Oklahoma when oil was discovered, knowing that there was money to be made, just a new gold rush all over again, just naked, unabashed greed, and Scorsese trains an unflinching lens on all of it and focuses upon it and makes us realise that the community that existed in Oklahoma largely did so to bilk the Osage community through a variety of different means. It was just normalised and commonplace. A good example of this is a scene where Ernest takes a storekeeper aside and asks him, "You're not charging me those Indian rates, are you?" Referring to the fact that the prices for indigenous peoples were massively inflated because they knew that the Osage could pay for it. And the storekeeper tries to justify himself, going, "Well, I'm a businessman, I am the one that's actually working, I'm the one making money," as if his business didn't exist off the back of extortion. And that's on the mild end of the scale, because to these people, the lives of the Osage were far less than the money that can be gleaned out of them, even after death. And so it's no surprise that when the Osage start dying in very obviously homicidal circumstances, a blind eye was taken to it for an exceptionally long period of time. The movie opens with a series of dead Osage people in very suspicious circumstances, culminating in a shocking moment of a mother being killed, which is just simply assumed to be self-inflicted, even though we've seen the evidence that is very blatantly not. And it's here where we meet DiCaprio's Ernest, having come to Oklahoma after returning from the war, and during his earliest scenes in the movie, Ernest serves as something of an audience surrogate in that he's learning about the Osage people, and we learn through him, be it through conversations with other characters or reading about it in books. And over the course of the movie, you can see Ernest become more familiar with the culture and hierarchy and the kind of dynamics that in this community. He understands how to switch between the two worlds and actually does learn the Osage language. He starts out not understanding one word of it, and then later in the movie, he's having full-blown conversations with Molly in the Osage tongue. But by placing Ernest as the central figure, the viewpoint from which much of the film is seen from, Scorsese sets the audience in a slippery trap, in that Ernest, in his earliest scenes, invites the audience's empathy, or at least us to relate to him to a certain degree, and then we gradually realise that he's completely amoral. In fact, as he admits, he just loves that money, maybe even more than Molly herself, as he admits in that very same scene. He will do anything for that money. But we also realise that he's a fool simultaneously. He's someone who is so greedy that he can just be very easily manipulated. To a certain degree, he's a tool. He's exploited by his Uncle King as much as he is a perpetrator in the crimes as well. And so DiCaprio is kind of wrestling with this complicated character, but it also invites the audience to maybe also assess their own complicity and how that they would relate to someone like Ernest. And like the aforementioned shopkeeper, Ernest justifies his crimes to himself. He gets in a relationship with Molly and marries her, and he believes that he loves her. He believes that he's protecting her and working in her best interest, and he convinces her of that fact. All the while, he's involved in this conspiracy to wipe out her entire family, and yet he can somehow have the moral dissonance to do both of those things simultaneously, because he sees that as being the extension of his love for Molly by protecting his own wealth somehow. It's only later does the growing burden of guilt actually start to weigh down on Ernest. And what held me back about the movie to a certain degree is that I never really connected to Ernest as the central figure of the movie. As much as DiCaprio is really working hard in the role, I always saw him as a snake, as one character describes him, because he is an opportunist, and that is the point. But then the movie also wants to convince you that he is actually in love with Molly, even though he is a part of all of these atrocities. It's this horrendous, toxic relationship that is destroying them both, literally, by near the end of the movie. But the thing is, I didn't really agree with the way that that was framed, and as such, I don't know if I was fully invested in Ernest's side of the story, and I think if you rebel against that, it does become a very long 3.5 hours, but luckily there were other characters that I found myself being drawn towards, specifically William King Hale, of course Scorsese's other frequent muse Robert De Niro in their 10th collaboration, and Hale is the great power over this land. He's a reserve deputy sheriff, he's built much of the town, he has great wealth, but also connections with the Osage people. What's so frightening about Hale, and what's so interesting about De Niro's performance, is that it's actually quite reserved. I'd imagine that a lesser actor probably would have shouted and used their physicality to emphasise the power that Hale exerts, and instead De Niro uses that quietly. Instead, there's very few moments where he actually blows his top. In fact, I don't think he ever truly does. There is a moment where he gets so frustrated he paddles Ernest, and that's perhaps the closest to a full-on outburst the character actually has. When we meet Hale at the beginning of the movie, he almost seems like he's an ally of the Osage people. He positions himself as one. He understands their culture and traditions. He speaks to them in their tongue. He is in the same meetings talking about the death of all of these people, while at the same time, he is the architect of the entire conspiracy. They're talking about trying to catch whoever did this. He's in the room with them, and he does it all with a friendly face. Ernest describes him as being the nicest person in the world, apparently oblivious to the true darkness and evil in his uncle's character. Someone that can command other people's deaths simply to get the money from their head rights. And what's even worse is that King has no remorse about it in the slightest, because he is absolutely and totally justified it to himself. There are several moments where him and Ernest are conspiring, and King actually positions it as being some sort of kindness or favour to the Osage. He is so completely involved in his own greed that he doesn't even have the concept of guilt. It doesn't even register to him, because he believes that he is in the right. He is so full of his self-righteousness, and he believes because of his power that he is totally and completely untouchable. Even when the FBI are starting to circle around them, King feels no fear about the situation. And I think that Scorsese knows how to get the very best out of De Niro, as anyone who has followed their filmography will be able to tell you. But I genuinely think this is some of De Niro's best work in quite a few years. But for me, the best performance in the movie is Lily Gladstone as Molly, who is easily the film's heart as one of its few sympathetic characters. Ernest is warned very early on that the Osage don't typically fill the air with conversation. They deliberately leave silence so that people trip themselves up around them. You can see that with Molly. She's a very intelligent, very perceptive woman, even though she doesn't speak an awful lot in her earlier scenes, especially when Ernest is trying to court her. But Gladstone conveys everything the character is thinking. You can tell that she's watching and judging Ernest the entire time, building a kind of assessment of him, and eventually starts to become quite charmed by him. And despite the bad judgment of others, Molly falls completely for Ernest. She finds something in him that connects to her and then trusts in him completely. Over the course of the film, she absolutely puts her faith in Ernest, unfortunately. Of course, at the time, she's also dealing with the fact that there are these murders going on, and eventually that starts hitting very close to home. and you can see in Gladstone's performance how much of an emotional toll this is starting to take on Molly. And Gladstone's performance is a howling wail of agony, one that encapsulates the whole 3.5-hour movie. The whole film feels like a cry of anger and desperation at this deep injustice that we are witnessing before our eyes. And Molly's strength and conviction means that she keeps on fighting for her family and for her people, and to find justice in any kind of way. Even when she's deeply sick, Molly still tries to go out to Washington to personally try and invite someone to investigate the situation, even as it starts to envelop Molly in its grasp. And Scorsese further illustrates how hostile the culture was to the Osage through the fact that Molly, like many of them, is diabetic. And this is the result of the high sugar diet that is in the town. She's actually told by a doctor at one point that if she continues to, quote, eat like a white, she's likely to die. The introduction of insulin is a major plot point in the movie. Molly is lucky enough to be one of the first people to be introduced to it, but she grows extremely paranoid and suspicious of everything around her, including the doctors who are coming to administer the insulin, to the point where she actually throws them out and trusts Ernest with her medication, which of course proves to be a major undoing on her part. I actually found myself wondering if Scorsese had maybe slightly misaligned the narrative, in that I would have actually preferred to have seen the story told from Molly's point of view as opposed to Ernest, especially because that's what the film teases. In that earlier montage of the Osage deaths, it's being narrated by Molly, and so I thought that Molly was actually going to be our focal point, but deliberately over the course of the film, Molly starts to subside in the narrative, especially as she succumbs to more of the effects of what's happening. The problem is that I felt that Molly was the closest link the audience has to the Osage culture. As Molly's presence starts to recede in the narrative, so too does the Osage viewpoint overall, which is somewhat disappointing. She becomes the avatar, essentially, for that, and that means that as I came out of the movie, I kind of found myself thinking it could have done with slightly less killers and a little bit more Flower Moon. In terms of narrative, I do think the film almost touches the limits of what you can fully convey in a feature film, even one as long as this one, and what might have been better served in an episodic television mini-series. But having it in this form, especially because it's continuous, you see the scope of the death and murders in this community. It brings this huge, almost unfathomable weight across the audience, especially without any kind of interruption. Scorsese wants you to feel uncomfortable. He wants you to be angered and shocked. You've got America's betrayal of its indigenous people just writ large across the entire movie. It is betrayal after betrayal after betrayal. Yes, the movie is procedural, and yes, it is to some degree episodic. It does go into cul-de-sacs at points because it's trying to tell this very multi-stranded story, especially because it spans across such a lengthy period of time. But by trying to encapsulate something with this much scope into a feature film, you do have to make compromises. You have to choose what to include and what not to focus upon, and sometimes that does become noticeable. The thing that I particularly noticed was that Ernest and Molly's kids are barely even peripheral characters. They're very briefly established, but you don't see them a lot of the time, and that wouldn't necessarily be an issue aside from the fact that there is a big emotional moment for Ernest much later in the movie that's related to his kids, and it's meant to be something of a turning point for his character, but we've barely seen him with his children throughout the entire movie, so that rang false for me, despite the fact that DiCaprio is really acting his heart out. There are a few moments where I thought thought that the film could have been tightened up slightly, but overall, I do think that Scorsese avoids trying to make the film too dry, and certainly with the great cast of actors, that never becomes an issue, especially later on when you've got Jesse Plemons and the whole FBI angle. In its final half hour, you've also got the introduction of Brendan Fraser and John Lithgow as the dueling lawyers in the courtroom section of the movie, and this has drawn some criticism because the performances of Lithgow and Fraser, who has especially drawn a lot of ire for some inexplicable reason, their performances are big in comparison to the rest of the movie, but it's deliberately so. They're meant to be theatrical, both because it serves the epilogue of the movie, but also because their characters are turning the trial into a circus. It's meant to be completely out of control. They're doing exactly what they need to do, but also courtroom drama is very hard to do. It's very hard to convey that without it becoming too boring, for a lack of a better term. And I do think the presence of these two character actors adds a welcome injection into the movie of energy at a point where it could have very easily buckled at the last hurdle. And I do think that Fraser, even in very limited screen time, he makes a very distinctive impression. I actually was quite impressed with Fraser's performance, especially in that one-on-one scene with DiCaprio. It's a movie that requires patience. It demands your attention. Sometimes movies have scenes that almost feel like instructions on how to watch them. Killers of the Flower Moon has a great example of it. There's an early dinner scene between Molly and Ernest where a storm is going over the house and he starts to close the window because rain is starting to pour in, and Molly tells him not to and sit back down. Ernest tries to speak and Molly tells him to be quiet, be silent, and just allow the storm to pass over and wash over them. And that is precisely how you're supposed to be watching the movie. You're supposed to be quiet, pay attention, and just allow this horrible black cloud of murder and death pass over in front of you and fully take stock of it. That is how the movie needs to be seen. It's taken some time for my feelings on Killers of the Flower Moon to fully form, not least of which because I saw it at 8:30 in the morning. It's a lot of film to process first thing in the day, but when I came out of the movie, I was definitely wrestling with some complicated feelings. I felt in some senses almost disappointed by it initially, especially because I don't entirely think the movie's viewpoint is quite where it needs to be, and I do think that it needs more Osage in it. But as time went by, as I thought upon it more, I began to respect and appreciate it as well. I also think that it's a valid attempt at trying to tell a very dark and very undertold chapter of American history, one that's almost been actively suppressed in many ways. Yes, it's an imperfect movie, but it's also an important one that deserves to be seen. I do think that it's a movie I'm not going to revisit very often. I don't think it's my favourite Scorsese movie, and it's a very heavy and harrowing feature, but it's also one that I think it's important for people to see. And the movie does have a terrific ending. I do think that the Radio City epilogue is actually the film's genius masterstroke at the end. Certainly, I think that that is where Scorsese wrestles with the idea of turning this story into entertainment in its own way, but also shows just how quickly something can also be forgotten as well, and I think that that is an absolutely genius touch. If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page or YouTube's Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video. You can find all my social medias on my Linktree page, or you can go to my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, or you can simply like, share, and subscribe. It all helps. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.